1852. The Missouri River bank at Independence. A woman is standing in the mud, looking at a wagon. It is the third one she has looked at this week. Her husband is counting coins into a trader's hand. Two children are sitting on a trunk behind her. The youngest has no shoes. This is the beginning. This is what going west looked like before anyone took a single step. And if you think you know this story, the wide open land, the promise, the freedom, you're about to find out how wrong that picture is, because the trail did not kill people with outlaws and ambushes. It killed them slowly, with heat, with bad water, with a broken axle in the middle of a flat plain, with no trees in sight and nothing to fix it with a child who stopped eating on day 30 and did not get better, with a husband who pushed the oxen too hard because he was falling behind schedule, and the schedule was the only thing he could control. 1 in 10 people who set out for Oregon or California did not arrive. That is not a small number. That is thousands of people buried in unmarked ground across 1,200 miles of open country. Most of them not from arrows or robbery, from thirst, from fever, from decisions that had no good answer. Welcome to Mystery Wild West. And this is one of those stories that changes how you see everything that came after. Before we go any further, do you have family history connected to the westward migration? Grandparents, great-grandparents who made that journey? Tell us in the comments, because this story belongs to real families, and some of those families might be yours. Stay until the end of this one, because the real story of the Overland Trail is not the story most people have ever been told. And if this is the kind of history that actually happened, rather than the kind that gets cleaned up for textbooks, subscribe now. There is more where this came from. Let's start at the very beginning. Not the romantic part, the practical part. The part that already contained the seeds of failure before the wheels ever turned. A family in Ohio or Missouri or Indiana would spend months, sometimes a full year, preparing for the journey. They would read pamphlets, guides, advice from people who had supposedly made the trip. Some of that advice was good, a lot of it was wrong, some of it was written by land speculators who needed people to go west so that the value of their holdings would increase. They were not exactly lying, but they were not telling the whole truth either. The pamphlet said, bring flour, bacon, sugar, coffee, dried beans. Bring tools, bring rope, bring a good rifle. They listed weights and quantities and made it all sound manageable. What they did not say clearly enough, and what most families found out too late, was that the weight limit was almost impossible to maintain. A loaded wagon could carry about 2,000 pounds. That sounds like a lot. It was not enough. By the time you packed the food for 6 months, the tools, the bedding, the extra clothing, the medicine kit, the spare parts for the wagon, the seed for planting when you arrived, the family Bible, the iron stove that you thought you would need, and the things you simply could not leave behind because they were your life. The wagon was already over the limit. Before you added the weight of the children, the oxen were pulling something they were not supposed to be pulling, and that fact was going to matter. Somewhere around the 500th mile, it was going to matter a great deal. But here is the problem. No one told families what to throw away, and even if someone had, they would not have believed it yet. Not at the start. At the start, everything still felt possible. The departure from Independence or St. Joseph or Council Bluffs happened in the spring. It had to happen in spring. Leave too early, and the grass on the plains was not yet grown enough to feed the animals. Leave too late, and you would hit the Sierra Nevada or the Blue Mountains in October when the passes filled with snow. The window was narrow. Maybe 6 weeks, maybe 8. Everyone knew this. And so every spring, thousands of wagons clustered at the jumping-off towns, waiting for the grass, waiting for the mud to dry enough for wheels, waiting for other families to join, because going alone was not just lonely, it was dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with raiders. It was dangerous because if your wagon broke an axle, you needed other men to help you fix it. If your child got sick, you needed someone who had seen that sickness before. Alone meant truly alone. So the wagon trains formed. 50 wagons, 100 wagons, sometimes more. And that was its own problem. Think about what it means to move 100 wagons across open country with no roads. No maintained roads anyway. Ruts from previous years, yes. Deep, churned ruts in the wet sections that could swallow a wheel to its hub. But nothing you would call infrastructure. Nothing built to handle the weight. Nothing that accommodated the fact that 100 wagons all need water at the same time. The Platte River runs for hundreds of miles across the Nebraska plains, and the trail followed it westward. That should mean water was not a problem. That is what a person looking at a map might think. But the Platte River was, in the words of people who crossed it, a mile wide and an inch deep, muddy, alkaline in sections, difficult to drink from without making yourself sick, difficult to ford because the bottom was soft and unpredictable, easy to mistake for reliable. It was not reliable. A man driving his wagon alongside the Platte in June heat, watching his oxen strain, watching the water right there, might decide to let the animals drink. The animals would drink. And then the animals might start to slow down the next morning, and then stop. And then one of them might be down in its yoke by afternoon, and he would not know exactly why. He would think it was the heat. He would not know about the mineral content of that section of the river. He had no way to know. That is the Platte, an illusion of abundance. Now push further west, cross into what is now Wyoming, into the high desert sections. Here the game changed again. The water sources that guides had written about, springs, creek crossings, wells, were not always where they were supposed to be. Or they were there, but they had been used by the group that passed through 3 days ahead, and the water was churned to mud, or the spring had slowed to almost nothing in a dry year, or the water was there but it tasted wrong, and you were not sure if wrong meant sick or just different, and you had children to consider, and the next marked water source was 18 miles away. 18 miles in that heat with tired animals and a loaded wagon. How long does that take? Figure it yourself. And this is where things change, because this is where the decisions got made that you could not undo. A family camped at a bad spring, water low and silty and wrong tasting, had 3 choices: drink it and hope, ration what water they had left, and push for the next source, 18 miles, which in this heat with these animals might take all of tomorrow and part of the next day, or wait at the spring and hope it recovered and lose a day or 2 of travel time that they did not have to lose. Every one of those choices had a cost. There was no good answer. There was only the least bad answer, and you had to make it with incomplete information and exhausted judgment and children asking for water in the wagon behind you. This is what the pamphlets did not describe. 18 miles in desert heat, no shade, the ground cracked, the air still and white with dust. A family might ration the water and walk alongside the wagon to spare the oxen. The oxen were more important than walking. If the oxen died, the wagon stopped. If the wagon stopped, everything stopped. So the adults walked in the heat, drinking as little as they could stand. They arrived at the next water source, and the water was there. They drank. The animals drank. They made camp. By morning, 2 people in the wagon were sick. That is not a fictional scene. That is a composite of dozens of journal entries from people who survived the journey and wrote down what happened to them. The specifics change. The pattern repeats. Water was the first killer. Disease was the second. And disease on the trail had a particular cruelty to it because the trail was crowded. Think about what a wagon train actually was. Think about hundreds of people and animals moving through the same ground, camping at the same places, using the same water sources, breathing the same dust, living in close proximity for months. Think about the sanitation, or the lack of it. The trail was a vector. Cholera arrived on the overland trail in 1849. It did not announce itself. It simply appeared in camps along the Platte, and then it moved west with the wagon trains because the wagon trains were moving west, and the bacteria traveled with them in contaminated water, in soil, in everything hands touched. Cholera kills fast. A person who woke up healthy could be dead by nightfall, not dramatically, not violently in any romantic sense, just rapidly, wrenchingly, leaving the body destroyed and the survivors shaken in a way that did not go away. A wagon train moving west in 1849 might stop at a campsite and find fresh graves. That was common. Fresh graves marked the good water sources on the trail. In the darkest irony, because people stopped at water and people died of what was in the water, and people were buried where they fell. So the graves clustered around springs and river crossings. A family counting graves as they moved could use them as a kind of rough map. That is the reality of what the trail became. But here is what made it worse. You could not stop, not for long. You could bury the dead, and people did, whenever they could, whenever time allowed, but you could not slow the pace of travel significantly. The season was running. Every day lost was a day closer to winter in the mountains. Grief had to be compressed. Mourning had to happen while walking. A man buried his wife at a creek crossing in Nebraska in August. He had 2 children. He kept moving. There was nothing else to do. Stopping meant dying. So he walked. That is in the journals. That exact situation, with different names, appears more than once. Now here is something most people never consider when they picture the overland trail. The wagons themselves. The technology. The actual engineering reality of what people were relying on. A covered wagon, the kind that crossed the plains, was a sturdy piece of woodwork. Hickory frame, iron fittings, canvas cover. Built to last. Built by craftsmen who knew what they were doing, but built for roads, not for 1,200 miles of terrain that included creek crossings, desert hardpan, soft river bottom, rocky mountain descents, and the kind of continuous vibration that no piece of machinery was designed to absorb indefinitely. Wheels cracked, axles broke, wheel rims worked loose in the dry heat because the wood contracted and the iron no longer fit tightly. A wheel coming apart in the middle of the plains was not a minor inconvenience, it was a crisis, because fixing it required tools, skill, and materials you might not have. A spare axle weighs significantly. A family that had packed carefully might have 1 spare axle in the wagon, or they might have decided the weight was not worth it, that the odds of needing a spare were low, that they would be fine. And they were right statistically. Most wagons did not break an axle, but some did. And when they did, and there was no spare, and the nearest settlement was hundreds of miles in either direction, you had to find another solution fast. Sometimes another wagon in the train had spare wood that could be shaped. Sometimes There was a man with enough carpentry skill to improvise something that would hold for a few more days. Sometimes there was not. Sometimes a family had to abandon their wagon entirely, divide what they could carry among other wagons in the train, if the other wagons had room, which they often did not, and continue that way. Abandon the wagon. That means abandon most of what you owned. The stove, the furniture, the extra clothing, the things you could not carry. The trail west was littered with abandoned property. Travelers wrote about it constantly. Furniture sitting in the middle of the prairie. Trunks of clothing. Tools. A piano, once, reportedly, sitting open to the sky. Not because people were careless, because they had no other choice, because the wagon was too heavy, and the oxen were dying, and something had to go. Here's the question this raises. When you planned for a year and spent everything you had and loaded that wagon and left everything else behind, and then you had to start throwing things out of the wagon to survive, what did you keep? What did you decide mattered most? Most families kept food and tools. That was the rational choice. But people also kept things that were not rational. They kept the family Bible. They kept a child's toy. They kept a letter from someone left behind, not because they were foolish, because they were human, and they were terrified, and those things were the last pieces of the life they had left. The items that ended up on the side of the trail were the ones they finally could not keep. Imagine what it felt like to set something down by the road and walk away from it. Now add to that the oxen. The oxen were everything. This needs to be said clearly. Without the oxen, you did not move. Everything the family had, everything the family needed, their shelter, their food supply, their tools, their survival, all of it was in that wagon. And the wagon moved only because the oxen were alive and pulling. Oxen were chosen over horses for this journey because they were slower but stronger, more durable, better at the long grind. They could eat grass rather than needing grain, which meant they could graze along the route. They were cheaper than horses. They were calmer under stress. These were real advantages. But oxen still died. They died of alkali poisoning from bad water sources. They died of exhaustion when the pace was pushed too hard. They died of hoof problems on rocky terrain. They died of disease. They died because the grass on the plains in a dry year was sparse, and what looked like enough forage was not quite enough over months of constant pulling. A wagon train that started from Independence with 4 oxen per wagon might, by the time it reached the Rockies, have wagons down to 2. 2 oxen pulling a load meant for 4. And the solution was to lighten the wagon. More things on the side of the trail. More decisions about what mattered. And when an ox died, with no replacement available, a family might harness a milk cow to the wagon. People did this. The journals record it. A milk cow was not meant for this work. She was not built for it. She might manage it for a while, she might not. But it gets worse, because the Rocky Mountain section, specifically the descent on the western side, was where the wheels came off everything, in a figurative sense, and often a literal one. The descent into some of the western valleys required lowering wagons down steep grades that no draft animal could manage under control. This meant unhooking the animals, using ropes and men to hold the wagon, and lowering it by hand over sections so steep that a single slip could send the wagon tumbling. Men were hurt doing this, badly. A rope that slipped, a wagon that shifted. A man's hands burned through to bone by rope friction. A broken leg on a mountainside, 2 weeks from anywhere. And if you were hurt badly enough that you could not walk or work, you became a burden on the people around you. And the people around you were already at their limit. The trail demanded a kind of ruthlessness that people did not know they possessed until it was required of them. A family traveling with an elderly grandfather who became too sick to survive might have to make a decision no one wants to say out loud. You could not carry a dying man indefinitely when the wagon was already at capacity and the animals were failing. You could stay and wait and lose days you did not have. Or you could keep moving and leave someone behind at a camp with food and water and hope. There are accounts of this. Not many, because the people who experienced it did not always want to write it down. But it happened. The trail made people do things they never imagined they would do, and then they had to live with those things afterward. The ones who survived. That is the emotional weight that does not make it into the romantic version of this story. Let's talk about the children. Because the children died in the largest numbers, proportionally, and this fact tends to get softened or skipped. Children were vulnerable on the trail in ways adults were not. Their immune systems were not developed. They were more susceptible to the waterborne diseases that moved through camps. They could not regulate their body temperature the way adults could in extreme heat. They could not tell you precisely what was wrong. A child who stopped eating might be exhausted, might be dehydrated, might be sick with something that was going to kill them. You often could not tell which until it was already too late to change the outcome. The trail medicine of the 1850s was not nothing. Families carried medicine chests. They carried laudanum for pain, and calomel for digestive illness, and quinine for fever, and various preparations that the era believed in. Some of it helped, some of it was useless, some of it made things worse. Calomel, mercury chloride, was a standard treatment for cholera-like symptoms. It did not cure cholera. It sometimes poisoned the patient additionally. A parent treating a sick child with the best knowledge available in 1853 was doing everything right by the standards of the time. And it might not be enough. And they knew, some of them, in a quiet way, that they were working without the tools they needed in conditions that made everything harder, and that the outcome was not fully in their hands. That helplessness. Sitting in a stopped wagon on the flat plain with a sick child and 200 miles still to go and a season running out. That is not a scene from a Western film. That is what happened. Routinely. And now, here is the part that most retellings skip entirely. When the journey ended, if it ended successfully, if the family arrived at their destination in Oregon or California or the Utah Territory, arrival was not relief. Not exactly. Not the way people imagine it. They arrived depleted, animals dead or barely functional, wagons worn to the edge of collapse, supplies consumed or traded or lost. Arriving in October or November in the Willamette Valley meant you had weeks, maybe a month, before the rains came. You had to build shelter. You had to find food for the winter. You had no community, no neighbors you knew, no network. You were starting from nothing, in a place you had never been, with resources you had already spent getting there. Some families arrived and had to immediately hire out as labor to established settlers just to survive the first winter. Everything they had left home with, their stake, their investment in the future, had been consumed by the journey. They arrived as workers, not as founders. That was not what the pamphlets described. Some families arrived and found that the land they had been told was available was already claimed. Land claims in Oregon were complicated and contested from the beginning. The Donation Land Claim Act of 1850 provided land, but the reality on the ground was that good farmland near water, near existing settlement, was already taken. Later arrivals got the harder land, rocky or far from water, or in a valley that flooded every spring. Not useless, but not the promise either. A family that had spent everything to get there and arrived to find that the best land was gone had a choice. Take what was available and make it work because they had nothing to go back to, or push further into even less developed territory, with even less support, with whatever was left of their resources. Neither option was what they had imagined when they stood in Missouri and looked at a map and believed in the West. That is not a failure of the West. It is a failure of what people were told the West was. It is the gap between the story and the reality. That gap cost people everything. Here is something worth thinking about. The people who profited most from westward migration were not the farmers. They were not the miners. They were not the families in the wagons. The people who profited were the ones who sold to those families before they left. The outfitters and independents, the oxen dealers, the wagon makers, the merchants selling flour and bacon at prices that increased every spring as departure season approached and demand outpaced supply. A barrel of flour that cost one price in February cost more in April and more again in May. Everyone knew the families were coming. Everyone knew they needed to buy. The market adjusted accordingly. The merchants in the jumping-off towns made fortunes. They did not cross the plains. They stayed and sold to the next wave and the next. The risk was borne entirely by the people in the wagons. The profit was distributed very differently. A family in 1854 might spend every dollar they had, sell the farm, sell the furniture, call in every debt owed to them, and still find that they were short of what they needed for the journey. So they borrowed. They went into debt to provision the trip west. And if they did not arrive, or if they arrived and the land was not what they expected and the first year was hard, that debt followed them. The dream of the West was in some cases a debt trap. Not for everyone, not by design necessarily, but as an outcome, as the reality. No one advertised that part. Push forward a few years. 1857, 1858. The trails are better known by now. There are more established waypoints. There are some rough supply depots along the route, places you can buy emergency provisions for very high prices. The knowledge base has improved. People know more about what to expect. Does this mean the survival rate improved dramatically? Somewhat. But not as much as you might expect, because knowledge of the route did not solve the problem of drought in a bad year. It did not solve the problem of a disease outbreak. It did not solve the engineering limitations of wagons. It did not solve the basic arithmetic problem of 1,200 miles in 5 months with failing animals. The trail remained hard. The trail remained lethal in a quiet way, because knowledge of danger does not always mean you can avoid it. Sometimes you know exactly what is happening and you cannot stop it. A family in 1858 knows about alkali water. They know to watch for signs. They know not to let the animals drink from certain springs. And then they come to a section where the good water and the alkaline water are mixed, and it is difficult to tell which is which. And the animals are thirsty, and the decision is still hard. Knowledge does not make difficult decisions easy. It just makes you more aware of why you are afraid. Here is the question that sits at the center of all of this. Why did they go? Knowing what they knew, or finding out what they did not know. Why did people keep going west? Wave after wave, year after year, even as the stories came back east about the graves and the broken wagons and the families that did not arrive. The answer is not simple, and it is not romantic. Some went because they had nothing to stay for. A farm in Ohio that was played out, soil exhausted, debts too large. A business that had failed. A family that had fallen apart. For people with nothing at home, the West was not an attractive option. It was simply the only direction that felt like forward. Some went because the land was genuinely cheap or free under the Donation Acts, and land was wealth, and wealth was security, and there was no path to security where they were. The calculation was certain slow decline here or uncertain rapid risk there. Some people chose the risk. Some went because their neighbors went, because their cousin sent back a letter that described good soil and mild winters, and they believed the letter. Because when 10 families from your county are going and 5 of them ask you to come along, staying starts to feel like failure. Social pressure moved people as much as economic calculation, and some went because of the story of the West that existed in newspapers and in the culture, the idea that this was what Americans did, that the frontier was where the real life was, that staying behind was somehow lesser. The story was powerful. It was not entirely false, but it was not complete. The cost of the incomplete story was paid in graves along the Platte River, in things left on the side of the trail, in children buried in Nebraska in August, in families that arrived and found not the dream, but the hard beginning of a longer, harder life than they had imagined. And those people, the ones who made it, the ones who arrived and built the shelter and broke the ground and survived the first winter and the second one, they did not talk about it much. Not the hardest parts. Their children were raised on a version of the story that was slightly cleaner than the truth. The journals sometimes survived. Sometimes they were burned or lost or simply never passed on. The memory of how bad it actually was faded faster than the achievement. That is part of why the myth of the West became so much cleaner than the reality. Not because of lies exactly, because the survivors had reasons to look forward rather than back, because describing the worst of it served no purpose once you were standing on your own land with the house built and the crops in the ground. You had made it. Why keep reliving the cost? But the cost was real. It is real in the historical record, if you know where to look. In the emigrant diaries held in archives in Oregon and California, in the land office records, in the mortality statistics that researchers have assembled from fragments of evidence. 1 in 10. That number recurs in the scholarship. Across the peak years of the overland migration, across the different estimates, the figure of roughly 1 in 10 people dying on the journey appears consistently enough to be taken seriously. That is not a battlefield casualty rate. That is a travel mortality rate. For a journey, people chose to take. People chose to take it. And 1 in 10 did not survive it. And the ones who did survive it were changed in ways they could not always name. Now here is something that rarely makes it into the standard account. The impact on the land itself. On the route. 1,200 miles of trail used by hundreds of thousands of people and animals over 2 decades left marks that you can still find if you know where to look. Ruts cut so deep into the Wyoming ground that they have never fully healed. Native grasses stripped from wide swaths of the plains corridor by hundreds of thousands of hooves and wagon wheels, springs and water sources degraded, fouled, or in some cases completely destroyed by overuse. The trail was a river of people, and it scoured the ground the way a river scours stone, slowly, permanently. The bison herds that had ranged across the plains were cut by the trail, not immediately, not entirely, but the pressure of the migration, the hunting, that went along with it as people tried to supplement their food supply, the disruption of grazing patterns, all of it combined to accelerate something that was already happening. The reduction of the bison was not caused solely by the overland migration, but the migration was not neutral. It had a cost that went beyond the people in the wagons. The trail crossed through territories where people already lived. This is the part that most 19th century accounts either glossed over or framed in terms that do not hold up. The trail went through the hunting grounds and the territorial ranges of multiple nations that had lived in these places for generations. The wagon trains were not traversing empty land. They were passing through someone else's home. The interactions along the trail were complex and are often misrepresented in both directions. There was violence. There was also trade, guidance, and assistance. Native peoples along the route often sold food to immigrants who were running short. They guided parties through difficult terrain. They provided horses in exchange for goods the immigrants had. These transactions happened constantly and are recorded in the journals, though they tend to get less attention than the incidents of conflict. But the traffic itself was damaging, regardless of how any individual interaction went. The grass that the bison needed was being eaten by immigrant livestock. The water sources were being contaminated. The game was being hunted by people passing through in numbers those ecosystems could not sustain. The trail was a slow disaster for the people who depended on the land along its route, and those people had no say in whether it happened. This is the hidden cost that sits entirely outside the story of the immigrant family and their wagon and their survival. The cost borne by people who never chose to participate, who watched it happen, and who lost something permanent because of it. The standard history of the Overland Trail tells the story from inside the wagon, understandably, because that is where the diaries were written. But the story from outside the wagon is equally real and considerably less told. Move forward in time. 1862. The Homestead Act has passed. Land in the West is now available for essentially nothing, 160 acres. Prove it up in 5 years, it is yours. The migration intensifies. New waves of people, some of them newly arrived immigrants who barely speak English, some of them veterans of the Civil War who want to go somewhere and start something new, some of them families that have been waiting for exactly this legislation. And they still died on the trail. Not in the same numbers, because by now the Transcontinental Railroad is being built, because the route is better established, because overland travel itself is better understood. But people still died. Disease still moved through camps. Water was still unreliable in the drier stretches. Wagons still failed. And the ones who got to their 160 acres and proved it up and built the sod house, because out on the plains there were no trees, so you cut sod and stacked it for walls, and you lived in a house made of dirt. Those people entered a different kind of hardship than the journey. A stationary hardship, the hardship of a place that did not want to be farmed. The Great Plains were not farmland the way Ohio was farmland. The rainfall was irregular. The grass that supported the bison was not the same as what you needed to grow wheat. The winters were ferocious in a way that people from the east were not prepared for. The wind was constant and wore people down in a way that is hard to describe to someone who has not experienced it. Families built their sod houses and planted their first crops, and then sometimes watched the rain not come, watched the crops fail, held on through the first bad year because they had to, held on through the second bad year, and then sometimes they left. They gave up the claim and went somewhere else, or went back east, broke. The homestead promise was not false, but it was conditional on things you could not control, like weather, like commodity prices for grain that were set by forces far away, and that a single family on a quarter section of Kansas prairie had no ability to influence. The dream of independence was real. The conditions for that independence were much harder than advertised. Here is the final question to sit with. What does it mean that this happened? That this mass migration happened? That hundreds of thousands of people made this journey, and 1 in 10 died, and the ones who survived were permanently changed, and the land was permanently changed, and the people who lived there before were permanently dispossessed? What does it mean that we know all of this, and the dominant image of this era in the American imagination is still a clean adventure, a hero on a horse, a wide horizon, a promise fulfilled? The adventure was real. People did make the journey. People did survive extraordinary difficulty. There is genuine resilience in the story. That part is not false, but the adventure was not clean. The cost was real, and it was distributed unevenly. The people in the wagons paid enormously. The people along the trail paid in ways they did not choose. The land paid, and the accounting of all of it was never fully done. A grave along the Platte River, marked with a wooden stake that rotted within a decade and left nothing. A name that no one now knows. A family that kept moving west because stopping was not an option. That is the Overland Trail. That is the actual thing. Not the wide horizon. The grave along the river. The decision to keep walking. The story was always both things at once, the promise and the price. The people who tell only the promise are not exactly wrong, but they are missing half the truth. And the half they are missing is the half that was paid by someone, that mattered to someone, that happened to real people in real conditions with real consequences. The West was real. The cost was real. 1 in 10. That number means something. It should not be forgotten.